All right, today's series of interviews are taking place at the 7th Regimental Armory here in New York City at the occasion of the New York Antiquarian Book Fair. We will have 10 interviews today, and we're going to start off our first interview with Bob Fleck of Oak Knoll Books. And Bob is a former president of ABAA and a former president of ILAB, a well-traveled gentleman. And Bob, can you tell us a little bit about your background, family, where you grew up, schooling, etc.?
Yeah, sure, Mike. I mean, I actually was born in Philadelphia. My parents moved to Delaware when I was 3 years old. Went to all my schooling there, and then my dad transferred up to Buffalo, New York. So off I go to Buffalo, New York, 10th grade, 11th grade, 12th grade. Decided I wanted to follow my father's footsteps, i.e. be a chemical engineer. And so I did that. I came back to Delaware. Delaware had a very strong chemical engineering school. I thought that would be a good place to go. Went there, then went to grad school, University of Virginia, got a master's degree. But meanwhile, when I was kind of back at the other, going to my undergraduate work, I started working at Getty Oil Company, the one and only refinery owned by that grand old book collector, Getty himself, in Delaware City, Delaware. I worked there as like a summer engineer. When I went to Virginia, I finished my master's degree, and then I was going back, starting my doctorate, got 3 months into it, went back to a Delaware football game, and my old boss, who I worked as a summer engineer, said, "Oh, why don't you come back? We need someone right now." PhDs were not making any money. They couldn't find jobs. So I said within a month I was back in Delaware working for Getty Oil Company. And as soon as I had $1 to my name, I started collecting books. And my big collections were Hemingway, Faulkner, Steinbeck, all the people that I don't really sell today. And I loved those kind of people, Saul Bellow, those folks. But I also loved reading and understanding books about the trade, books about book collectors, books about publishing history. All those things were really of interest to me. So I did this for like 5 years. My now ex-wife and I we were given the opportunity to buy a daycare center. She was a teacher. We owned the daycare center. Guess what? We decided to buy a second daycare center and a third daycare center. So 5 years down the road, when I went from Getty Oil, then to Arco Chemical, then to Air Products and Chemicals, long commutes all the time. I was being transferred to Allentown, Pennsylvania, to become some new thing in chemical engineering. And I said, wait a minute, I don't want to do this. I love books. I had started actually selling some books on the side, because as soon as you start collecting books and you buy bigger collections, you end up with duplicates of what you got. And so what do you do with the duplicates? You start selling it. And what I started doing, I kept all those, by the way, all of my AB ads and all those that I started running, trying to sell books. So 5 years into it, being transferred, I look at the daycare centers, I look at what I really enjoy doing, and I said, wait a minute, I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to be an engineer. I gave my notice, so Friday I was an engineer, and Monday I was a bookseller. And I can't ever forget sitting on my bed on the second floor of our house, waking up on a Monday morning and say, whoa, now I'm a bookseller. I've never worked for anyone else in my life. What do I do? I mean, what is like the first thing you kind of do with this? So I came up with what I thought was a business plan, and my business plan was to convert all my literature, all my book collecting, into books on the history of the book. Because I said, no one else is really doing this. No one else is really selling books as a specialty, where they concentrate on books that describe the distribution of books, publishing history, book selling history, and the physical production of books, so printing, bookbinding, papermaking, and reference books. So I traded sold these literature collections I had, went out and bought all the books about books I could, and created catalog number 1 in 1976. Mailed it off into the world. I forget how I got the number of people, Royer Club lists or whatever. And a guy from Ripley, Tennessee calls me up and orders 80% of the catalog. And I say, this is a really easy life, this book selling. I mean, how can you fail doing this, you know? And it became progressively harder, catalog 2, 3, 4, etc. But then I had the really fortunate experience of meeting a collector by the name of Elida Rushvarg. She was, at one point, operated the biggest paperback bookstore in Manhattan. Then she moved to Long Island. She was always a collector of books about books, had formed a fabulous collection, saw what I did, said, I'm ready to sell my collection. I called her back and said, that's wonderful. Unfortunately, I don't have any money really to buy that collection.
Typical bookseller.
Yeah, and so she says to me, well, tell you what, I want to work with you on a series of catalogs listing my books, and I'll help you with the descriptions of the books, and I'll also fund it in a way. I'll let you pay me off over time, although we really had to come up with the secure notes and all the rest of it. But she did that, and we issued this whole series of catalogs describing her collection, which was fabulous for me because it allowed me to handle books that I probably never would have been able to handle in that field. We got Lawrence Clark Powell to write a little envoy to the whole catalog. It was just a very enjoyable experience.
You were working by yourself at that time?
I was working by myself. My first employee was, the one thing I quickly knew that I didn't really enjoy doing was packing books. And so I managed to get a guy who was very interested. He was working in the medical field, and he says, I would like to come work for you in exchange for credit to buy books. This is another my kind of guy, right? And so he did. He came and went to my basement and wrapped all the books that I had in exchange for having credit to buy literature, in his case. So we went out and bought all the Tom Wolfe books that he wanted. That guy just showed up after, this was 1976 when I started, and he probably came in about 1977. And he showed up at my shop last year, the first time in 30-some years. And he said, do you remember me? And I said, how could I forget you? You were the first guy who worked in... He doesn't collect books anymore. But then I did it out of my home. We did start in the second floor, then moved to the living room. Then we had a 2.5-car garage. We converted that into a book office. I actually hired a secretary at that point. And the other thing we started in 1978 was, and I don't know if you can, this is a history of the publishing company, Oak Knoll Press. So we started that in 1978, again in Newark, Delaware, at 680 South Chapel Street. And just a couple of books here and there. Bigmore and Wyman, the famous bibliography of printing, was the first book we did. It was a co-publication with someone in England, the Holland Press. Of course, just like every other bookseller in the world, we ran out of room. And in 1979, I started looking for someone to partner with. I know I needed more help, and I didn't really have a lot of money. So I had been doing a lot of business with John and Emily Ballinger down in North Carolina. He was still working for a living while doing bookselling part-time. So we started talking, and what we decided to do was to form a partnership of sorts. He would bring in some cash, and he would bring in a lot of books, and I would bring in a lot of books, and we'd kind of make that a joint venture. The $20,000 he brought into the business allowed me to put a down payment on a house, on a storefront really, in Newcastle, Delaware, which is only 20 minutes away. It was a grand old place. It was a 19th century building. It was the butcher shop in Newcastle for that whole period. I ended up buying it from like the 5th generation butcher there, Herb Tobin, what a character. So what we did, we had the bookstore on the first floor. We combined all resources. Emily and John lived on the second and third floor of this building, and I rented the space. I bought the building, and then I rented the space to them, and et cetera. That lasted about 3 years. Partnerships are tough duty in the book business. Yeah. And so we decided, amiably, I'm not quite sure, but we decided we would split up. And John and Emmy went to the book press down in Williamsburg, and I kept the book business. And even more importantly, in 1982, I married a new wife down there, who was a little lady that I moved into next door to in Newcastle. I rented a place with my brother. She was living next door. Didn't take long before we were an item. We ended up getting married, and then we moved to the second and third floor of that building. And of course, then ran out of room pretty quickly thereafter. We had kind of lusted after a house 2 blocks down the street, the old doctor's office in Newcastle with an attached doctor's office to it. A nice a house that was the first part was built in 1713. Then the wing was added in like 1795, had a lot of history to it. Turns out that this house was also the birthplace of Robert Montgomery Bird, who was a kind of a contemporary of James Fenimore Cooper, wrote a whole bunch of fiction, Nick of the Woods being the most famous one. We moved the bookstore into the doctor's office and into the home, but my banker allowed me to keep the old bookstore, which we then rented to a lady who thought she was dealing with ghosts or something. That didn't last too long. Did the store there for a while, totally ran out of room again, moved back, renovated the 3-story building, and put a new basement in it, ran out of room again, and then 11 years ago we moved to this great the Newcastle Opera House, which was built by the Masons, 1879. It had the Masons, typical all over America, these buildings. The Masons met on the 3rd floor. They had an opera house on the 2nd floor, 28-foot ceilings. Stage is still there to this day. Annie Oakley performed on that stage. They have the records of all these people. And then the 1st floor, they rented it out to essentially pay for the building. So I moved to the 3rd floor. Then eventually I ended up taking half of the 1st floor. Then eventually ended up taking the whole building, but using the 2nd and 3rd floor of the building. The publishing kept going okay. That's been a lot of fun, lots of good stories about talking to authors here, there, and yonder, and how it all interacted with the bookselling part of it all. Became very interested in my organization, the ABAA. First got on the board back when Johnny Jenkins was on the board, way back when. Got off the board for a while, then was called kind of into action when the treasurer of the ABAA decided not to be treasurer, and it turned out that a lot of the accounting was really messed up. So our mutual friend Doug Harding calls me up and says to me, I got a shoebox full of receipts. How would you like to be part of a new committee to figure out what the heck is going on with our finances? Which I did, and that eventually led me to become treasurer of the ABA for many, many years. Became president in 96, I think that was, 96 to 98, because I know we had our Congress in California, which is a fun event. Very pleasant. I remember it was so warm in Santa Monica. My farewell speech kind of to all the people on the steps of the Huntington Library. I looked out over the crowd of all these people dressed up in their suits, and I said, in truth be told, after our session at the beach yesterday, I've never seen so many iLab dealers with so few clothes on in all my life as has happened. But it was just a grand event. Then we went up to San Francisco and had the actual book fair. It was a lot of fun, that whole thing. My prime interest during this period was this new thing called the internet. And I was really interested to see how my business personally could benefit from the internet and how it could be used to tell the world about the ABAA, why this group was important in its own right, why the books that you bought from them were protected by the ethical standards of the organization itself, how the people in that organization were the professionals that know how to describe books. I thought it was a great way to get the name out and to sell some books, and by golly, it sure did at the beginning. I think everyone who got in early on that did a lot of business on the internet. Maybe not quite as much right now, but in those days it was a fast-moving thing. I also became interested in the International League of Antiquarian Booksellers. We had some problems in America with Peter Howard had been not elected to the committee. There was a lot of bad feelings all around. They knew they wanted someone there to talk to them about this new thing called the internet. So the first time in iLab history, they formed a subcommittee, and that was devoted to the internet. And they had me involved with that. Eventually, they decided this was a good idea, so we kind of hired this guy, Jelle Sumshausen, from Rockingstone in the Netherlands. We flew him to America, and we had a planning committee meeting, I remember, up in Amherst, Massachusetts, where he and two other people presented their views of what we should be doing as an organization with a database. And he was the winner of that bidding contest because he had already done something for the Dutch. He had done some work for iLab. The ABA decided this was going to be our person. And we negotiated a great deal where you could list all your books in iLab and get your books listed for nothing on the ABAA site. So that worked out pretty well for a while. I ended up more and more getting involved with the International League to the point where I was nominated to go on the committee by the ABAA. I got on the committee, and it really became obvious that it was time for an American to maybe go the next level. We had only had one president in the history of the ABA to become president of iLab. It was a very Eurocentric organization. Richard Wormser was the first president. That was back in the 50s, late 50s, when he became president. They weren't ready for me to become vice president with the obvious idea of becoming president. And they had nominated Keith Fletcher to become the vice president. Keith is a sweetheart of a guy, but he was not into this progressive ideas on where the internet would be leading us as an international organization. And just all these years I had been working doing this, I could just see it maybe going down the tubes if that had happened. So I don't usually fight for things like this, but in this case, I really tried to fight for it. I tried to get many people in the ABA to support my leap to the vice presidency. We did a lot of past presidents kind of emailed the committee. I met with a lot of the past presidents. I'd gone to all these congresses all over the world with iLab, and that had allowed me to make my impact with the different presidents. Push comes to shove, Keith and I worked it out that he decided to go on the committee and I became the vice president. Many of the people who were running iLab at that point said, no, you shouldn't even try this, you're going to lose the vote. But I managed to convince them that they were going to lose the vote. So my best mentor in the world was Anthony Rota, and I remember a lunch with him. He says, it's not your time yet. And I said, yeah, it's my time, and that's what I want. And so he finally said, fine. And so I became president in 2002. I was asked to serve again in 2004, so it was a 4-year term. And I can continue to be involved in that. I mean, we're going through turmoil again with the internet, and I really want to make sure that we don't lose what we've gained so far. Just came back from Barcelona. I was there for the most recent meeting. I've now been named a President of Honor, which is the first time an American has gotten that one. And what that does allow, it allows me to go to all the meetings if I so choose, as long as I pay for it myself, which I don't mind doing. It's important enough to me. I think the International League is great. And some of these young booksellers in America who haven't experienced going around and meeting the foreign people and saying, I deal in modern literature, I'm never going to be selling books over there. What do I care? It just isn't true at all. It really isn't true. So I think that kind of brings me up
well,
to date.
As I recall, Bob, the iLab functions used to be a lot more social and a lot more old boy type things. And since Kay Craddock's term in office, they've become more business-like and less social. Is that a fair assessment?
Well, I mean, I think bookselling has changed in that period too. I think that booksellers have less time for being social. I think booksellers are working harder to make a living these days. And the idea perhaps of, as we experienced in America when the Philadelphia Congress fell apart, the idea of spending 5 days away from your business, spending a lot of money for social activity in a world where you can get some social activity instantaneously using the internet or Skype or whatever you happen to be using that day, it's a harder concept to sell. We're really troubled with that on the whole concept of congresses. Barcelona, the most recent one, Madrid, the most recent one, took a long, scary time to make sure that that didn't fall apart too. Michael Steinbach was great at holding that together. But I think it's a shame, and one of the things that I recommended at this last committee meeting is that we work really hard again on the concept of providing scholarships for younger booksellers to experience these congresses. I sort of promised that I'd try to go after the Breslauer folks again on some of that. We just got the Breslauer people to kick in $108,000 for the bibliographical prize to fund that forever, the special $10,000 prize we give out. The social aspect is getting lost somewhat, and I think it's a shame because I have experienced business all over the world. It's not just social. Every social minute also allows you to interact with people that could do business with you later.
Absolutely.
And some people just don't get that.
Well, I think the fact that the organization started to meet every 2 years because they wanted to keep together is no longer a concept because you have the internet and information. When someone sneezes in California, somebody in London says Gesundheit. I mean, that's the world we live in today. And I think perhaps we should think in terms of ILAB meeting every 4 years instead of every 2.
Could be, but that certainly is a possibility that we would do something like that. I mean, the presidents meet every year.
Right.
The odd year for the presidents, the even year, I guess, for the Congress or vice versa.
Yeah.
But the interaction, I mean, the email is great, but there's nothing more important than sitting down with someone, maybe with a glass of wine and a social occasion, getting to know that person, and then doing some business. I'm about ready to leave for the Netherlands to see Rockingstone again. But meanwhile, I'm going to stay with a Dutch dealer who comes to America back and forth, and stay with him for 2 nights. I'm going to meet with another Dutch dealer that I'm going to do a distribution deal for my publishing. Then I'm going to France to meet a French dealer that I've gotten to know here to do business with. It's just so important to keep that kind of contact going.
Well, listen, talk a little bit about one of the real fun things you do in the book business, Oak Knoll Fest. So if that's correctly pronounced.
Oak Knoll Fest, right. 15 years ago, we decided, I think it was a sales tool, obviously, more to it than that probably. We decided to invite some people that still print books by hand, believe it or not, there are people like that in the world, to come to Newcastle and spend 1 day showing off their wares and then have a conference about privately printed books there, invite the whole public there, have a 20% off sale at the shop so they buy something. And it worked out so well that actually the first one was held on the second floor of the building that I'm in now, back in the days when it was really a stage and an opera house. It led to, we just finished our 15th one of these this last year. It was a very intense, we had a workshop, all-day Friday workshop for 10 librarians and 10 private press printers, where we sat them in a room together and let them go back and forth about what good are these books, these artist books or private press books. I mean, why should I as a librarian be buying them? How do I justify that? All these important questions, and pricing books, and how do you notify me about books? It worked out great, that session.
Is this going to be an annual event now?
So I've just made a decision, however, because there's 2 other events that are going on this year. There's the Codex Fair in California run by Peter Koch, which was a 2-day event devoted to private presses. And then this year, every other year is the Codex Fair, and then every other year, this being the year, is the Oxford Book Fair. So now we've decided to have Oak Knoll Fest every 2 years. So next year will be the next one. And the workshop concept is definitely going to stay. I mean, that is, everyone really liked it. It gives the librarians one more reason to be able to ask their boss if they can have payment to come to Oak Knoll Fest, because they're now participating in it. It's great fun. We've enjoyed them all. To do this book that I just wrote on the 30th anniversary of the press, I had to put together the archives, because it's amazing, you know, how fast you forget all these things.
Amazing,
so now I have 19 albums in chronological order of all the little things that I've kind of saved over the years, and so many of them are these fest memories of the party we have every Saturday night at the fest in our backyard, and it's just been a grand experience of meeting people.
Great. Okay, we've got about 5 or 6 more minutes, and let me ask you some general questions, Bob. For example, what do you think about, what would you say to a young person or a middle-aged person or an old person who suddenly came to you and said, Bob, I'm thinking about becoming a bookseller. Advise me. What points would you make? What few things would you say to them that are essential for them to know about?
I think the first thing I'd say is you better have the passion. This is another kind of life. I mean, you might not become the richest person in the world financially. If you're smart and you have a good business plan, you'll make money in it, but it is a fabulous life. You're going to have a life like no other, with the travel involved and your own hours, your own boss, and just wanting to go to work in the morning. I mean, I remember times when I was a chemical engineer when I didn't want to wake up and go to work. Is it going to snow today, please? So I love that. The most inspirational thing that's happened to me recently is the fact that I have 4 children. None of them were interested in the business. And after 30-some years, you start to wonder, well, where is all this going? Why do I keep working so hard? But now my youngest son, Rob, who graduated from college, is now, after a year and a half in the business, is still as enthusiastic as anyone at it. He's always wanting to learn new things. He loves going out and meeting people, and they're kind of essential things to being a bookseller, I think. Wanting to get out there and talk to people and educate them about what you're doing, tell them why what you're selling makes sense and why it should be collected. Yeah, it's a great life, and if someone needs to have the temperament to do it, to be a business person, to be self-disciplined, to be passionate about what they're doing, to recognize maybe they're not going to be the most wealthy person in the world, but boy, it's a fabulous life. And I hope all those youngsters who meet that criteria, I welcome them to the field.
And your son is also a graduate of the Colorado Book Seminar.
I know. He
Put
loved
a
it.
Plug in for that.
I know. I heard he was very good out there. He was the only one who managed to gather all the free beer at the end of it all and take it back to the room, showing entrepreneurship.
Well, before we close down, just to tell me a little bit what you think the great challenges are for booksellers today, especially for someone like yourself in the reference book business, where people keep on saying, reference books, I thought that was going to be my retirement. Now it's a chain around my neck. What would you respond to that?
Now, I think that all specialty dealers that have large inventories of more common books in their field that used to be kind of the bread and butter of their field are finding it really difficult to sell that kind of book. So my advice to anyone is you really just have to sit down and constantly reinvent yourself. You have to constantly think of, like John Carter said, of maybe new paths in book collecting, where my own field, I mean, people still buy bibliography. I know there's a lot of doom and gloom. I publish bibliography and they buy it, and I sell out of print bibliography and they still buy it. Books on the history of the book, I mean, there's so many different ways to look at that, in new ways, perhaps, to look at that. I'm still convinced that no one in America is really collecting the history of bookselling like it should be done. Mm-hmm. If I asked you to name all the libraries who I could quote books about bookselling to, and knowing that they would buy it, or publishing history, or library. There's lots of different things that.
There are lots of great challenges left. Yeah. Bob, you said before that you sort of started on day one buying books by Hemingway, etc. Go back a little bit in your mind. Think of some of the booksellers who may have been mentors to you, and tell me about some of the booksellers that you have mentored. We've got about 2 or 3 minutes.
Yeah, so in the old days, of course, it was the booksellers in my field. Muir Dawson and Agnes Dawson were great people. Muir, and that's another iLab. I wouldn't have gotten to know him unless it had been all these congresses we went to. I'm the one that picked up the phone with you, I think, and convinced him to become president of the ABAA way back when. He was a sweetheart. Anthony Rhoda, I've already mentioned so many hours I spent with Anthony and Jean Rhoda. Rostenberg and Stern, they're the ones that got me nominated for the ABAA, in spite of the fact when I mentioned that at one of our annual meetings, they said, "No, we didn't," and out loud, as they only they could do. So, and then Herman Cohen at Chiswick Books, I ended up buying all his inventory at the end, but he was a good bookseller that I knew for many years. In terms of who I'm mentoring, I'm not.
Other than your son.
Sure, yeah, I mean my son, obviously. I hope that maybe in a more global sense that some of the stuff that I'm doing that is kind of preserving this, I hope preserving the way we do bookselling and allowing some of the younger people to come up by keeping people in mind that ABA does mean something and iLab does mean something and you should be part of that organization. Maybe that's my way of mentoring.
Do you feel deep down in your heart that this organization is going to outlast the booksellers that are currently in this generation?
Yes.
And you think it will continue to be a viable force in the trade?
I really think it will, because I think that you just look at what's going on with eBay and all these other sites where you're just a little nervous. People are nervous and upset sometimes when they buy books that they're not going to get what they think they're going to get. And if we can just keep hammering away at, we guarantee what we sell, and we're professional people who have been vetted to become part of this organization, eventually that message is going to start sinking in somewhere.
What's the next ILAB Congress and Book Fair?
So the next one will be Italy.
And when?
Next year, not this coming year, but
2011?
Yeah, right.
In September.
Yeah.
Thanks very much, Bob. Appreciate your 30 minutes, and we'll keep plugging Oak Knoll Fest.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.